In the spotlight tonight, Edward Snowden. He now has competing offers of asylum from 3 countries, and we have new video from his interview with The Guardian last month in Hong Kong.
I enlisted in the Army shortly after the invasion of Iraq, and I believed in the goodness of what we were doing. I believed in the nobility of our intentions to free oppressed people overseas. But over time, over the length of my career, as I watched the news and I increasingly was exposed to true information that had not been propagandized in the media, that we were actually involved in misleading the public and misleading all publics, not just the American public, in order to create a certain mindset in the global consciousness. And I was actually a victim of that.
Edward Snowden describes what inspired him to release classified documents.
I grew up with the understanding that the world I lived in was one where people enjoyed a sort of freedom to communicate with each other in privacy, without it being monitored, without it being measured or analyzed or sort of judged by these shadowy figures or systems anytime they mention anything that travels across public lines. I think a lot of people of my generation, anybody who grew up with the internet, that was their understanding. As we've seen the internet and government's relation to the internet evolve over time, we've seen that sort of open debate, that free market of ideas, sort of lose its domain and be shrunk.
Today, Venezuela and Bolivia confirmed receipt of Edward Snowden's official asylum requests. On Saturday, the Bolivian president offered asylum to Snowden. On Friday, the Venezuelan president did the same. That same day, the Nicaraguan president said he would grant Snowden asylum if circumstances allow it, whatever that means. And today, White House Press Secretary Jay Carney said this.
The United States has been in touch via diplomatic and law enforcement channels with countries through which Mr. Snowden might transit or which might serve as final destinations for Mr. Snowden. And we've made very clear that he has been charged with a felony or with felonies. And as such, he should not be allowed to proceed in any further international travel other than travel that would result in him returning to the United States.
In an op-ed in the Washington Post today, Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers 42 years ago, wrote this. Many people compare Edward Snowden to me unfavorably for leaving the country and seeking asylum rather than facing trial as I did. I don't agree. The country I stayed in was a different America a long time ago. For the whole 2 years I was under indictment, I was free to speak to the media and at rallies and public lectures. I was, after all, part of a movement against an ongoing war. Helping to end that war was my preeminent concern. I couldn't have done that abroad, and leaving the country never entered my mind. There is no chance that experience could be reproduced today. Joining me now, MSNBC's Richard Wolff. Richard, there's so many things to cover here.
Yep.
Let's get to the asylum situation. And the difficulty for Edward Snowden seems to be, how would you get from Moscow to any one of these places without crossing airspace that European airspace you won't be allowed to cross?
Right, especially when they're so far away. You know, here's someone who went to Hong Kong for safekeeping and then on to Russia, where he thought he would have some measure of protection as well, and none of that came to pass. So he's now a very distant place away from where he thinks he might end up. But, you know, there's also a statement of intent in these countries that he's going to. In the interview, he talks about government's relationship to freedom of the individual. What government is he talking about or thinking about when he goes to China or Russia, or if he ends up where I expect him to end up, which is Venezuela?
Well, you know, in his defense on that point, I would simply go to the point of he will be more effective not in prison anywhere in the world than he would be able to be effective in any way in prison in the United States.
I think we have to understand he is already peaked in terms of his maximum effectiveness. You know, what we're seeing now is the more of his interviews that come out, the more questions are raised about his misconduct, the more he interferes with the debate that he has successfully triggered. There is a real debate to be had about the FISA courts, about supervision, checks and balances, about the limits of what surveillance should be. But all the while, he's engaged in this cat and mouse game, and his intent and his credibility is thrown into question. He is hindering the very debate he seeks to trigger.
I think I see it more as he takes up some of the space, a lot of the space in that debate, but that debate is still floating out there because of what he's done and because he's still at large. I think if he was just in custody, and it would be much harder to get the debate going. I was struck by the first thing he said in this new video. I enlisted in the Army shortly after the invasion of Iraq.
Right.
He enlisted in the Army more than a year, not just a year after the invasion. It was a year after Bush did the mission accomplished thing.
Right.
The Iraq War was so already a failure on its own terms. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and we knew that.
Exactly.
When Edward Snowden, oddly, very oddly, claims this idealistic notion about joining the Army because of the invasion of Iraq.
Right. And this also throws, this gets to the question of his intent. It throws into question, when did he sign up to the job he currently did? Was he somehow outraged by what he found at the time, working for Booz Hamilton, or was it actually prior to that? Was he outraged because he was such an idealistic young man who signed up after 9/11? Well, it turns out it wasn't after 9/11 because of what happened in New York and Pennsylvania and elsewhere. It wasn't because of the invasion of Iraq itself. So what's the truth here? And this is what I mean by him getting in the way of what is a very, very important debate. His credibility is coming into question with these kinds of interviews. Frankly, The Guardian's credibility is. This interview isn't in response, as they have pretended it, to questions. This was an interview that was done many, many weeks ago, before there were any questions, before anyone actually knew who Snowden was.
Well,
there's too much hype going on here about a very important thing.
I guess there are two different stories. One is the NSA story based on the revelations of Edward Snowden, which is a big and important story that should have its own life. And then there's this other story, which is the plight of Edward Snowden. Right. And that's where it becomes interesting who he is, because what you're seeing here is an expression of stunning naivete, which, by the way, isn't even true, when he says, I enlisted in the Army shortly after the invasion of Iraq, and in the same sentence goes on to say, I believed in the goodness of what we were doing. In Iraq, a year after mission accomplished, how impressionable can you be, and how subject to very quick opinion change can you be?
Right. Well, if you're a libertarian Ron Paul supporter, maybe that's a mindset that would have tracked for him. Someone who was very trusting of conservatives, who found that, according to the web chats that we've seen, he thought that the New York Times leaks when in the Bush years were awful, and leakers should be shot in parts of their body that would be very painful. So, he has undergone some kind of conversion. That doesn't mean the debate is illegitimate. It just does raise questions about his character and judgment.
Richard Wolff, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Coming up.